Alrighty, people, we are live. It's going to be a special stream when I got a haircut. Got a lot of haircuts now that the barbers are open. And I put on a shirt, and I had the other shirt on, the one with the stripes, but I remembered the wise advice of someone on the stream who said, don't wear stripes on live streams because the compression causes the vibration of your shirt and it makes it unpleasant to look at. Okay, people, so this is going to be a Canadian-centric stream. Sometimes people complain that I cover too much of the American side of law and current events. That may be true. It's just I find that fascinating because it's sort of like not the forbidden fruit, but not the fruit that I have on the tree in my backyard. But we're doing the Canadian question tonight. Lockdowns, the Constitution, the lawsuits that are springing up across the country. We're going to talk about the law, and we've been talking about it a lot in the past. I've been covering it with my, evening or every other evening, Viva on the Street, talking about the latest updates in Quebec and Canada. And people were asking me, have I heard of JCCF, which is the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms? I hadn't heard about it until I heard about it, and I started following them. And the president founder, John Carpay, has been doing big work on this. And I reached out on Twitter or DM, I forget how I reached out, but said we're going to do a stream and he's going to tell us what his organization is doing. We're going to talk about the law, the Constitution, which people seem to have forgotten exists, or at least maybe don't appreciate the importance of why it exists. And we're going to field some questions. So first things first, standard preface, nothing in this stream or any of these streams is or constitutes legal advice. If you have legal questions, contact a lawyer in your province, state jurisdiction. We may not have a problem with the super chats tonight because I do expect this to be a tighter crowd given the geographic relevance of this stream. If I miss super chats, I apologize. I'm going to try to get to the questions. I'm not going to bring them up in the same way I do with Robert Barnes, just because I first time stream don't want to distract too much. And I've got my line of questions that are going to cover a lot of the questions I've already gotten that I know people are wanting me to ask. So with that said, share this out now. Remind people it's out. YouTube's notification system has been 50-50. 50-50 at best. And let's just bring up the first super chat, which I see. Get your fellow Montrealer GadSad in for a live stream too. There's big news coming. Tomorrow's going to be a big day for a good interview that's coming out that's going to be published tomorrow. And I'm going to be reaching out to get some other very fascinating discussion interviews going on the channel. And I'm hoping a few actually spawn off of this because we're going to talk about some of the Canadian things which you might not believe happen in a Western society that we are now seeing happening all too often. So with that said, John Carpay, president and founder of JCCF, the Justice Center, I'm going to mix up this, Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Very interesting history. And I've been watching some of his interviews online. Very interesting person. I'm going to bring him in. We're going to do the intro. We're going to start getting some questions going. Put your questions in the chat. I'm going to try to follow it, but I'm not going to be bringing them up because I don't want to distract too much. But without further ado, we shall bring in John Carpay. First of all, I've been in my head all day. I've been saying Carpe Diem. It can't be the first time you've ever heard it.
Seize the day. Yeah.
No, I feel like with a name like Carpe, you have to have heard it. With
yes.
we get the same jokes. First of all, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. Thank you for coming out. I think people have a lot of questions, and it's good to have an authority and someone who's in it. From what I understand, up to your neck in it. To explain what's going on. So first things first, who are you? Where are you from? And what's your background?
So I was born in the Netherlands and I came to Canada at the age of 7. I grew up in British Columbia. And after doing 1 year at the University of British Columbia, I transferred very far east and did the last 3 years of my degree at Université Laval at Quebec. Came there with just grade 12 French only. And I got pretty fluent pretty quickly because the language of instruction was French and the readings and so on and so forth. And then I lived in Ottawa for 2 years, worked on the Hill for part of that time, got to see a little bit of the inside of government, back to British Columbia for a few years, and then when I was 28 years old, I moved to Calgary to go to law school, and practiced law in Calgary for a bit. Lived in Edmonton for 4 years. Worked for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation as the Alberta director. Came back to Calgary, and for the past 15 years, I've been doing public interest litigation, basically working as a voice for freedom in Canada's courtrooms. And so now the Justice Centre provides for more than full-time work, as we've got a team of about 10 lawyers, soon to be 11, taking on court cases all over Canada.
Okay, that's fantastic and phenomenal. And I mentioned it to you before we started, but my alma mater for my law degree was Université Laval, where in year one, I was the student rep, year two, editor-in-chief of the law journal, which was a first, and then year three, president of the Law Student Association. So it's a good university, and it has produced a lot of talent. The question is this now, so your law degree, did you specialize in anything, and how did you get into tax from your law degree?
Well, I'm not really in tax. You mean constitutional law?
Well, okay, so what was your practice when you got into
Okay, excellent question. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is an advocacy group advocating for lower taxes, less waste, and accountable government. So I practiced civil litigation after my articles and being called to the bar. I practiced for about 1.5 years, and I found it was all paper and no people, and I was never in court. Because if you want to get into court a lot, you need to do criminal law or family law. And then the Canadian Taxpayers Federation was an advocacy group that I was already familiar with, and I was a supporter of it. And when I heard that they were looking for an Alberta director, I quit my law job and moved from Calgary up to Edmonton, where the legislature is, and was there for 4 years. So I was not really practicing law those 4 years. And then I moved back to Calgary to do the public interest litigation work that I'm doing now.
Okay. What is, for those who don't know, public interest litigation means what exactly?
Well, it's constitutional law where you are taking on cases where the charter rights and freedoms of people are being violated, like right now with the lockdowns. But pre-lockdown, a lot of campus free speech cases, religious freedom, parental rights and education. And these are cases where the court's ruling has a big impact on public policy, on the laws of the country, more so than, say, you're at a law firm and you've got two big corporations are suing each other, one wins, one loses. Doesn't necessarily have much of an impact on people's lives. But when you have the constitutional litigation, and you're taking issues like religious freedom or freedom of expression to court, then it has a big impact on the law.
Okay, I'm pulling up one comment right now because DSWP says he did some work with my father years ago. Great choice, Viva. Okay, so do you start your practice through the JCCF, or do you create that after you've been doing litigation for a few years?
Well, I worked for a different group for a number of years, and I founded the Justice Centre in 2010. So we're a little bit over 10 years old. And initially, a lot of our cases were in campus free speech. We did have an interesting healthcare case challenging the government's monopoly over healthcare. We're trying to extend the Shauli decision, which you're probably familiar with, of course, that the Supreme Court said that access to a waiting list is not access to healthcare, and it's a violation of our charter right to life, liberty, and security of the person to not be allowed to use our own resources to access healthcare outside of the government's monopoly, when the government monopoly is subjecting us to suffering and harm to health by keeping us on a waiting list. So that was a case that so interesting. We didn't win, but that's another big topic, of course, the healthcare system. And so over the years, the Justice Centre has grown. We have taken on www.jccf.ca. I'm trying to think, what is, what there's so many of our cases, it's almost hard to decide which one to talk about.
Well, actually, and before we even get there, the one question people were asking me is people who want to, say, get involved, or people who want to know what they can do. JCCF operates nationally and not strictly out of Alberta?
That's correct. We've got court cases from British Columbia to Newfoundland, and we're funded entirely by voluntary donations from people. So we do not ask for or receive any government funding, and we've got 9 or 10,000 Canadians, including Quebecers, that are donating. And some people it's $1,000 a year, some people it's $200 a year, $50 a year, and it all adds up. And because of that funding, we've got our full-time lawyers, and we provide the legal representation without charge. Because this is the problem with constitutional law, is that most people, for your typical court action, you can't do anything unless you've got a spare 50,000 sitting in the bank. And unless you're part of the 1%, I mean, almost nobody has got a spare $50,000 for litigation that's kind of sitting around. So this is a good way to defend rights and freedoms when they're threatened by governments, because when we take on a client, the client does not pay. If they want to make a donation to the Justice Center, they can, but there's no obligation. Our clients do not pay. So right now, for example, we're representing people all over Canada who've had $1,000 tickets, $1,200 tickets, just for peacefully exercising their charter freedoms. And we're taking on these cases, and we're going to give the government a run for its money and say, look, if you want a conviction, you better bring some evidence into court about the need for these lockdown measures, and you better show us the science.
Yeah, it's people don't appreciate the time and the money that goes into all litigation, but especially litigation where you're not suing for anything monetary. You're not suing for massive payouts. You're suing for recognition of constitutional rights, which on the one hand doesn't carry monetary value, but on the other hand is invaluable. And for anybody who follows Ezra Levant, Rebel News, you know that when they fight what seem like tedious, menial tickets, fines, $3,000 for his book, when there are questions of principle, it costs money to pursue them. People don't fully appreciate that, the cost and the time. Like a typical constitutional case, how long, if you give the audience sensitize them to the hurry up and wait of law, how long does it take to get from beginning to end, definitive end?
Okay, well, it's a whole spectrum. I'll give you one example of a case that did not take an enormous amount of time, effort, and energy. This would be on our website. It was a license plate case in Alberta, and a guy, you can put on a personalized license plate, and you pay, I don't know, $200 extra or something, and you can put, lawyer in Ontario named Karen Selleck has a license plate that says "cut government" or "cut GOVT."
Yeah.
You can put down, your girlfriend's name, or you can put down Maui if that's your favorite vacation place. And, government is not obligated to have personalized license plates. But once they do allow that, then government should not be censoring the expression on the license plate. So somebody had free AB Alberta, free Alberta was on the license plate, and he applied for that, and the registrar of motor vehicles said no and turned it down. And we ended up writing a demand letter, strongly worded, and they ended up backing down, and it didn't go to court, and so the guy's got his plate. Another license plate case has taken an enormous amount of time, effort, and energy, and that's Mr. Lorne Grabber in Nova Scotia, or Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And so his German-Austrian last name is Grabber, and it's spelled Grabher. And I think in German it's pronounced Gräber, and it's a fairly common German name in Austria and Hungary, Austria and Germany rather. And he had that plate on his car for 27 years. It was originally his father, and then his son, and then Lorne Grabber. And then there's one anonymous complaint from somebody who was traumatized by the 2016 US election, when the Republican candidate said something about
something about grabbing.
Yeah, something about grabbing. Now, normally, I mean, you wouldn't even think about this. It's Graber, Grabher, but it happens to have an H there. There's lots of English words with a silent H. But somebody got it into their head to be offended about this, and then immediately, without giving Lorne Grabber any due process or an opportunity to respond, they revoke his plate. We took this to court. There's Montreal University professor Carrie Rentschler, I forget which university, radical feminist, says that having this license plate is going to lead to violence against women and it promotes rape culture. Just nuts. So we had to, get expert evidence in rebuttal, which was not cheap. And so we had our PhD says no, that's nonsense. Of course not. That's not that license plate is not going to hurt tourism or lead to women getting hurt. And sadly, the trial judge actually bought into the gibberish of Carrie Rentschler and ruled against us. So now it's before the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal. So even on license plates, you go from a fairly quick case that maybe was a dozen hours, 2 dozen hours, to this gigantic, enormous expert reports, expert evidence, expert testimony, cross-examination, court appearances, appeal to the Court of Appeal. So they can range from very small to very big. The ones coming up that are even bigger than the Grabber case in terms of the volume of work is that we are taking the lockdowns to court, and we've commenced charter challenges in Alberta and Manitoba, and we're pulling out all the stops. We are getting expert medical reports. We're challenging the PCR testing. We are going after the government data on the numbers of deaths, and we're questioning, is it true what the government claims, that we should all be afraid of this virus? This is like a full-fledged, multiple affidavit, expert reports, expert witnesses, lengthy cross-examinations. So these anti-lockdown court actions are huge.
Like,
and
we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, easy, huge.
Yes, although our model is a good business model because we have staff lawyers, and so even though they're not paid poverty wages, but they do earn a chunk less than what they would working for a private law firm. But having our staff lawyers, we can actually provide legal representation at about half the cost, maybe even a third of the cost of what it would cost if you went to Miller Thompson or some big, large national.
Borden Ladner Gervais was where I was groomed for 5 years or 7 years. So 5 years. They're a national firm, but it's one thing to have lawyers working in-house, sort of, on a what they accept to be a lesser salary than in a big firm. But the experts themselves are not going to be much cheaper, regardless of where you go. You still need to get top-notch experts who cost something of a small fortune.
That's true, and thanks to the generosity of donors, we're able to afford that. So if occasionally, and if in a particular court case, if we get an invoice for $10,000 or $20,000 or God forbid $30,000 for an expert report, if that's necessary for the success of the litigation, we retain the expert and we pay for it. So in that sense, we're like the bigger firms. But if BLG was handling the Justice Center's cases, the fees billed out to clients would be twice as much or 2.5, 3 times as much as the annual budget of the Justice Center.
This is not a comment on BLG in particular.
No. I'm not picking on those. Any large firm.
Yeah, any one of the Big Ten in Canada, Stikeman, Miller Thompson, Davies, if it's not called that anymore, Norton Rose. It's an arm and a leg. Like they bill out junior lawyers, first-year lawyers at $250 an hour. I think it might be even more now. This is what it was back in the day, and it is what it is. Like, they have overhead, they have skyscraper overhead, and it's the nature of the beast. Okay, fascinating. And before we get into specific cases, a lot of people out there don't appreciate the Canadian structure, that we have a Canadian charter at the federal level, and each province has its own provincial charter, which has something of a different scope. So if you water it down, simplify it down, explain to the general public what the Canadian charter is and what the distinction is in scope and application between the Canadian charter and every province's provincial charter of human rights.
So the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into force in 1982, and it shifted Canada from what had previously been a British system of parliamentary sovereignty, where if you didn't like the law, your only recourse was to use the democratic process and lobby to have the law changed, or vote in a different party, vote in a different members of parliament, and you could not go to court and say, well, this law violates my charter, equality rights or free speech rights or Aboriginal rights, this, that, or the other thing. Then we switched to, in 1982, under Pierre Trudeau, we switched to an American-style constitutional democracy where citizens can, if they have the money, which most people don't, but theoretically at least, you can take a law to court and you can ask a court to strike down the law. So for example, in these lockdown actions, we're going to court and we're saying, look, these lockdowns, they violate our religious freedom very clearly, restrictions on churches are closed, or they can't have full capacity, they can't sing in church, etc. It violates our freedom of association because it's illegal to have your mother over for Christmas dinner, so you cannot associate with her in the way that you would like. It violates freedom of assembly because it's illegal to protest at all, or illegal to protest in numbers greater than 10, whatever the province. So we're going to court and we're asking the court to strike down the health orders as being unjustified violations of our charter rights and freedoms. So that's basically how the charter works. The lawyers and academics and historians will continue to debate whether it was a good move or not. A lot of people will say that we have more freedom prior to 1982, prior to the charter becoming part of our constitution. And if that's true, then, I mean, the other big question would be, if it's true that we have less freedom today, is it because we adopted the charter, or is it just a general cultural thing? So that's the charter in a nutshell. It's the supreme law of the land, which means that government legislation, laws, policies, health orders, the chief medical officer of health, everybody has to comply with the charter. And so if the chief medical officer of health puts in an 8 p.m. curfew, for example, which is a restriction on Charter 7 right to life, liberty, and security of the person, so obviously a liberty constraint if you're not allowed to leave your house without a dog after 8 p.m. So there is an example that somebody can go to court and say, look, this curfew violates our Charter Section 7 right to liberty, and then a court will hear the government's argument as to whether that violation is justified or not.
Okay, and I suspect it's the same in all of the provinces, but the lawsuits that have been filed in Quebec are challenging the Emergency Health Act. It's La Loi sur la Santé Publique, Public Health Act, which I suspect it's the same thing in the other provinces, in that you have these health emergency laws that allow you to implement emergency orders that are renewable for 10 days at a time, with what I understand is a maximum of 30 days renewal, before which it has to go to the provincial National Assembly to be debated and adopted as a law. Is that the same basis of the lawsuits that are being the reason for the contestation in the state, in the provinces where you're filing?
Our focus is on challenging the constitutionality of the health orders that have been issued by the chief medical officers. And we have two main grounds of argument. One of them is that these are unjustified violations of our charter rights and freedoms. The other big argument, which does not involve the charter, because our constitution is bigger than the charter alone, our constitution calls for democratic accountability. And the idea is, and it goes all the way back to Magna Carta in 1215, that there should be no taxation without representation, and that the laws apply to everybody, and that people have input into the laws. This is democracy as part of our constitution. So normally, if you have a law that applies to everybody, then it's passed by the legislature, so it's the elected representatives. So there's an indirect consent of the people for that law, or at least they have a chance to vote in a different government if they wanted different kinds of laws. And so there's a problem here with the chief medical officers basically acting like a legislature. It's like a one-man or one-woman legislative assembly that is passing not just a narrow health order that says, okay, we've got an outbreak in this little village, so we're going to quarantine a village, or we've got sick people, we're going to force sick people into quarantine. That would be what I think would be an appropriate use of power by the chief medical officers. What we've got instead in every province is the chief medical officer making laws of broad application, laws that apply to all of the people to say you can't go outside after 8 o'clock, or your kids have to wear masks at schools.
Yeah, or you can't open your business. You're restricted in terms of capacity wherever. Yeah, the tendency, and we'll get into how it's been politicized and sort of anyone who objects sort of gets demonized, but they've been issuing what would otherwise be emergency orders that have effectively been applied as law in the absence of any formal debate and legislative passage, and it doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon.
It's terrifying. I mean, we're going on 12 months. March 15th was the day when in most provinces it was, March 15th, March 17th. It was around that time we started the violations of our rights and freedoms as citizens started almost a year ago. And myself, I was fine with it as a temporary measure, because at that time we were told, we now know this is not true, but we were told that COVID is an unusually deadly killer. It's just going to kill millions and millions of people all over the world. It's going to destroy the health of huge numbers of young people. And now today we have the government's own data and statistics tell us that no, the lethality of COVID is in line with the annual flu. It's a different demographic. COVID is more deadly for elderly people. The annual flu kills children ages 0 to 5 every year. COVID is not killing children. So the lethality is the same. But sorry, here's my point. As a temporary measure, when we didn't know the facts, okay, that's fine. Now we're a police state where police can barge into your homes without needing to go through a lot of steps as they did previously to get a warrant to enter a home. People are being issued tickets for just being outside or not wearing a mask, or trying to run their business, or having family over at Christmas time, or spending time in person with friends. And a lot of the rules are just obviously stupid. I mean, they're illogical and contradictory. Well, we see that every day.
But before we get there, before we get to the ones that were admittedly not correlated to the objective, way back in the beginning of this, when I was doing the vlogs and the COVID lockdowns happened, and I said I don't want my channel turning into just covering COVID stuff, but I started looking into it, and I did a video on the Quarantine Act, which I think nobody knew existed until all this happened. Nobody knew we had a Quarantine Act, which gave the power to the government to declare basically anything and everything under the guise of, or under the pretext, or under the actual state of a pandemic, with massive jail time, massive fines, and powers that were so broad. Had anybody read it, they would have said, okay, well, we never need to worry about quarantine hotels. We never need to worry about detention centers, et cetera, et cetera. But we're, a year later, we're there. Now, in terms of, and I don't want to get into the statistics and the debated aspect of this, but in your pleadings now, the position you're taking is that, and you're going to try to make your case, and it's going to be up to the government to, try to rebut or try to defend the actions taken. But two questions for people who may not appreciate this. How quickly does this move? Like, do you go in for emergency orders, or are you going in for declaratory judgments, which we're going to get, a judgment on once the whole question has become academic?
Well, unfortunately, litigation moves at the pace of molasses in February, as the old saying goes. It's very tragic because justice delayed is justice denied, right? And that could be a whole separate topic. I mean, how do we fix the slowness of the litigation? Do we amend the rules of court? Do we appoint more judges? That's a whole separate topic, but it does move slowly. So I typically a court action, you're looking at 2, 3, 4 years. However, there is an opportunity to apply for an interim injunction. So what we can do and likely will do is we filed the court actions. We're going to get most of our evidence in. Once we've got our evidence in with challenging government data and statistics on COVID mortality to rebut the government's claim that this is a horribly deadly killer that we should all be living in fear of. That's one point we'll challenge. We're going to challenge the PCR tests. We're going to challenge the notion of asymptomatic spread, because the government believes that people who are not sick are all dangerous spreaders of the virus. That's why we have lockdowns. We're going to have expert medical reports that go in there and say, No, asymptomatic people are not significant spreaders of COVID, so the lockdowns aren't even useful. So we're going to go after all of this, and then as soon as that evidence is filed, we're in a position to make an interlocutory injunction, an application for an interim injunction to try to get a remedy before 4 years down the road when we get a substantive ruling on the merits. So there is an avenue to speed it up a little bit that way by making an application for temporary injunction.
Right, and anybody who's been watching this channel, we've gone over the injunction, the different types: provisional, interlocutory, permanent. And just to refresh everybody's memory, in the States, sometimes it's called a temporary restraining order, which is sort of like an immediate stopping someone from doing something on an emergency basis. Provisional injunction is sort of an emergency injunction that typically, depending on the rules, will last for 10 days to a couple of weeks, or until you get to the hearing on the interlocutory. Interlocutory is less urgent, takes you to the final hearing on the merits, where you have a permanent injunction, which is going forward. So you have these different stages for anybody who's wondering, based on level of urgency. And in Quebec, we had a lawyer file a motion for a safeguard judicial review, and was requesting a safeguard, which is sort of like among the most emergency type injunctive relief, asking that certain curfew measures be declared unconstitutional and lifted. And among attorneys, we know this, but you have to allege irreparable harm when you want to get the emergency stage injunctions. In our province, the judge in Gatineau said you didn't allege irreparable harm. All you alleged was you have to stay at home after 8 o'clock, which is not insufficient for irreparable harm. And we're not going to grant you the safeguard. Good luck on the merits. But the question I had was, so you're not going for the emergency type to declare them unconstitutional, lift them right now. Do I take for granted you're not doing that because you just don't think it's going to work? There's no judge on earth who's going to lift these emergency measures, who wants to be the one to bear that pressure?
Well, we're not going to court tomorrow to say lift them right now, because the legal test is also different. When you're going for an injunction to lift them right now, the government's case is easier because there's a presumption that the law is valid. Whereas in the main action, the big action, the one that really matters, the one that's going to take 4 years, it's a very different test. It is has a government succeeded under Section 1 of the Charter to justify demonstrably that these violations of charter freedoms are indeed necessary and rational, and that they actually bring about more good than harm. So it's a different legal test, but we will do our best depending on the circumstances. It's going to be interesting because we're going to I always get a smile on my face when people talk about like we're taking the government to court. Look, we might lose, and that would be a very bad outcome. But the wonderful thing is, for the first time, governments are going to be required to answer questions, because they're not going to look very good if they go into the courtroom only with their news conference speaking points and answers to friendly softball questions that are tossed by I think lockdown supportive media, who are basically the mainstream media are a propaganda machine for the lockdowns, for the government, the very biased coverage. And so the government can get away with it in the political arena, and they can vilify people and say, well, if you're against the lockdowns and you're an idiot and you're not scientific, they can get away with that. If they try that in court, they're going to really jeopardize their case legally. The judge is not going to be impressed if the government says, well, all these people against lockdowns are just a bunch of uneducated, illiterate idiots who are rejecting science. They're going to have to show the science, and that's something that governments have not been doing very much at all. They claim science. They use science as a slogan, but when you ask a question, like what's the scientific basis of the government for the government's belief that asymptomatic people, healthy people, are dangerous spreaders of the virus? What's your scientific basis? They don't answer that question, but they will have to answer it in court.
So, and it's interesting. People should appreciate three things, breaking one down at a time. The Canadian Charter says we have fundamental rights and liberties sort of with a but. They can only be infringed in as much as can be justified in a free and democratic society. So we've had, there have been constitutional challenges to wearing a seatbelt. and there's been constitutional challenges to a variety of regulations that impede people's free choice. Depending on the level of interference, the standard of assessment is going to be different. But we have fundamental rights and freedoms that cannot be violated except as justifiable in a free and democratic society. So the more extreme the measure, the more justifiable it's going to have to be, and that's the balance. But people should appreciate that we have rights with a but, or maybe we don't actually have any rights. We just have privileges, depending on how you see it. The second thing, which is people should appreciate, is very interesting. And this happened, in fact, was in the Gatineau decision, where when you go in for an immediate provisional injunction to declare a law invalid, the judge said it, there's a presumption of validity, and it's a big burden to overcome as the plaintiff. But when you get to the merits, what you're saying is get to the merits, it's just a pure assessment test. Has the government justified the law as opposed to a presumption of validity?
Yes, yes. So if in our Alberta, Manitoba, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Ontario actions, if we go for an interim injunction, it is an uphill battle. There's a good chance that we will try, especially if we have transcripts of the cross-examination of the chief medical officers. This is that related point. Right now, from what I've seen myself, chief medical officers get tossed easy curveball questions every night, and I have yet to see any of the mainstream media ask some tough questions like, are these PCR tests reliable? Are they scientific? Do they accurately diagnose COVID? Is it really true that people who are not sick are dangerous spreaders? What evidence do you have that the lockdowns are actually working? I mean, it's easy to say, oh, they've saved thousands of lives. Okay, fine, make the assertion, but where's the evidence to back that up? In the court action, these chief medical officers are going to be sitting down at a table with a court reporter typing out every word, and they're going to be sworn in under oath, and they can't get up and leave. They have to answer the questions, and all their answers, the questions and answers, get typed up into a transcript. The transcript goes before the judge, and I think I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, these chief medical officers had better do their homework, because for the first time, they're going to have to answer some tough questions and have credible answers. And even if they have a credible answer, there'll be more tough questions to follow to probe that. I don't think they're used to that at all, because the past 11 months, they're just getting a free ride from the mainstream media. And
just so people might view that statement as something of a conspiracy theory, or, a theory that
not a conspiracy. No.
I'll clarify. You can interpret it the way you want afterwards, but just to know the facts. When people say the media is in the bed with the government, on the one hand, the media survives off federal subsidies, or federal grants. So it's sort of, there's an instinct to not bite the hand that feeds you. Also, it's a consideration to bear in mind, and I've mentioned it a number of times because I find it shocking and outrageous that our provincial government is spending $13 million a month on COVID awareness. Well, you have to ask where that goes, and that goes into buying airtime, advertising space in media that by and large is starved for cash to begin with. So you have this incestuous relationship where you might not want to be too mean, because that ad may go run somewhere else, and then you have to go actually get merit-based advertising for what is struggling media in the first place. So interpret it the way you want, but once money comes into play, it creates expectations, and it creates dependencies, and it creates an ecosystem on its own. One thing we know, we've seen it in the States and we've seen it here, they don't get very many hard questions, if any at all. And by and large, people don't even push back on the overtly outrageous statements, one of which comes out of our own province. Our health director, Horacio Arruda, when implementing the curfew, recognized that there is no concrete evidence to support the effectiveness of a curfew to stop the spread of a virus. And in another statement said, curfews are more for wartime to prevent nighttime riots than the spread of a virus. So interpret those things the way you want, but many people don't even know that they've been spoken because the media does not repeat them. So it's going to be an amazing thing. Cross-examination is when people buckle under the pressure or they rise to the moment. How many lawsuits do you have currently filed that are contesting the lockdown COVID response?
So you have 3 filed. The ones in Alberta and Manitoba are the largest in the sense that they are a full-scale attack on the lockdowns as being unjustified violations, and they're broad-based, including a lot of evidence going after the government on all of these issues. I mean, is this virus really the deadly killer you claim it to be? And PCR testing, asymptomatic spread. Lockdown harms is going to be a huge component, because under the Charter Section 1, I won't do the 4-part Oakes test. It's too...
it will bore people.
Yeah.
There's a big lawsuit, but
Here's my summary of the Oakes test. The onus is on government to show that the charter violating laws and health orders, that the benefits outweigh the harms. And that's my 1-sentence summary of the Oakes test. So we're going into court with all kinds of affidavit evidence on increases in opioid overdoses and deaths, increases in mental health disorders. We've got so many people suffering from stress and anxiety and depression, spousal abuse, child abuse, unemployment, all the ill effects of unemployment, people going bankrupt, everything, all the lockdown harms. We're going to put that before the court and say these lockdown measures are doing a lot of harm, and the government has to try to refute that and say, well, no, lockdowns aren't that harmful. I guess that will probably be their argument. But they also have to come up with evidence that the lockdowns are doing any good. And you can't just say in court, oh, they've saved thousands of lives. It's like, okay, fine, that's your claim. Where is your evidence that lockdowns have saved any lives at all? How on what basis would you say that, if we had not had lockdowns, way more people would have died? Easy to claim, hard to prove.
Well, and it's an interesting thing, because what they'll say is it saved lives, and there's going to be no question to that in the scope of their reasoning, because I can argue the devil's advocate position is they're going to say, in the scope of our objective, it saved COVID deaths. Then the question is going to be, even assuming that's true, every policy decision has pros and cons, and it has perils and pitfalls. So every policy decision is going to has a cost in addition to the benefit, and they're going to have to look at the costs. And one thing I don't expect to ever get a response from François Legault, but I've tweeted, first of all, three basic questions. SOR mortality rate of 2020. That should be a starting point for anyone's analysis. From what I understand, in the States, in 2020 there was a 10%. I believe it was a 10% SOR mortality rate, which sort of coincided which matched with the numbers. Canada, I don't know. I've asked, what suicide rates, what are they year over year, and overdose rates, and setting aside all of the incidentals, things we're only going to see in 25 years. I mean, how do you even measure that? So the government might, in some sense, might have an easy position, say like, well, I don't know what the incidental damage or the collateral damage is going to be in 25 years. All that I know now is we had objectives, we set numbers, and we brought our numbers down. One thing, and another question I haven't gotten an answer for, is year over year hospitalizations, even before this. I suspect they're going to have to answer and compare. Do you have stats on that yet?
This is there's so many issues to be covered there, but we released a report in December. The Justice Center did. It's called Flying Blind. It's on our website, www.jccf.ca. Flying Blind, and Statistics Canada tells us that the total number of deaths in 2020 is very much in line with total deaths in 2019, 2018, 2017, 2016. And this is significant because if this was something like the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920, to which, by the way, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has publicly compared COVID to the Spanish flu. Now, the Spanish flu killed between 50 and 100 million people, 50 to 100 million around the world, many of them people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. So it had a big impact on population life expectancy. Because we have to be honest, and an illness that shortens life by 4 months or 8 months or 12 months is different from an illness that takes decades off of your life. And medical science has always treated these differently, right? If you get a disease that's killing children, that's really having a big impact on life expectancy amongst the people, compared to something that is 90% of the victims of the illness are in their 70s and 80s and 90s and so on. So the whole mortality thing is crucial. And what Statistics Canada tells us, that the government's own data tells us, that we have not had an increase in deaths in 2020, which tells us that COVID is not an unusually deadly killer like the Spanish flu that, at least one politician has compared it to.
It's interesting. And I just lost my thought there.
Hospitalization.
Hospitalization year over year.
It is intellectually dishonest to pretend that hospitals are now overcrowded because of COVID and it's a brand new problem and we should all be afraid of it. The fact is, in every province, we've had hallway medicine for years. And there are reports from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, from the World Health Organization, from the Fraser Institute, from the Frontier Center. There's all kinds of reports and studies that show that Canadian healthcare is amongst the most expensive in the world when you look at per person spending, but our outcomes are poor in relation to spending. So we're the top spender, or some year second place, third place in terms of spending on healthcare per person. We're the big spender, but when it comes to doctors per capita, hospital beds available per capita, ICU spaces per capita, nurses per capita, MRI machines, CT scanners, you name it, we come in 7th place, 14th place, 11th place, 25th place. So we have a really rotten healthcare system where we're spending a lot of money and we're not getting very good outcomes in relation to the money. And that you can find those sources very easily. And so we've had overcrowded hospitals for decades. And every year the hospital gets overrun and the emergency rooms are flooded and the doctors and nurses are stressed out and there's hallway medicine. This is a long-standing problem. And now to pretend that suddenly, we have to be afraid of COVID because it's going to overrun our healthcare system, that's just completely dishonest.
It's an interesting thing. You just look into it for a few minutes, and then I saw how in 2018 they were complaining that the hospitals were overrun during the flu season. And the major problem is any discussion about this has been so radically politicized and demonized to some extent that people are going to look at you and they look at me and say, "How dare you, lawyers?
How dare you? How dare you?" Yeah.
How dare you? I didn't even mean it in the Greta way, actually, but they just say, "How dare you? You don't know what you're talking about. You have the Dunning-Kruger effect. You think you know more than you do because you're a lawyer who all you do is ever cross-examine experts in the context of litigation. What do you know? Just be quiet and defer to the experts." On the one hand, how do you respond to that? And on the other hand, I guess on the one hand and the other, how do you respond to it? And do you get the impression that the courts are giving you that same sort of stink eye?
Well, we'll have to wait and see what the court's take on it is, but there are over 50,000 medical doctors and virologists, epidemiologists, infectious disease specialists who have publicly endorsed the Great Barrington Declaration. And this is a document, the three primary co-authors are world-renowned epidemiologists and virologists. And the Great Barrington Declaration, just Google it. It's fairly short, and I'm not a doctor, but you don't have to be a doctor to read it. And it basically says, look, we know that COVID is a serious threat to seniors in nursing homes who are already dying of cancer, heart disease, emphysema, diabetes, kidney disease, liver disease, you name it. So if you're old and you're already in poor health and you're already dying of 3 or more illnesses, actually, in Alberta, and I think the data is similar in other provinces, 3/4 of the COVID deaths are amongst people who already have 3 or more serious comorbidities. So this is an illness that is dangerous. It's going to shorten your life by 4 months or 8 months or 12 months. However, for 90% of the population, it is not a threat. It's not a threat at all for children, for teenagers, for young adults, and for almost every adult under 60. It's just not a threat. So what we should do instead is we should focus protection on the vulnerable. And we should take, extreme, radical, expensive, do whatever it takes measures to protect the nursing homes, which would cost, a fraction of the hundreds of billions of dollars of new debt that we're incurring. You can spend a lot of money on improving the nursing homes and still spend a fraction of the new debt that we're incurring and the economic destruction. But these are over 50,000 medical doctors have signed on to the Great Barrington Declaration. So the guy on the street that says, you're just a dumb lawyer, you don't know anything about medicine, you don't know what you're talking about, I think the question in response is, what are your qualifications to say that the doctors who endorsed the Great Barrington Declaration are inferior to the politically appointed chief medical officer of your province?
Well, their answer is going to be, look, you have they're not all epidemiologists. There's allergists, there's pediatricians. They don't know. I mean, I've had the discussion. They just, it always becomes just a question of deferring to the authority that supports their foregone beliefs to some extent. And I've seen the way people try to undermine the Great Barrington Declaration. They say a lot of these doctors don't know what they're talking about. They don't operate in the area, and you have to defer to the ultimate authority, Fauci in the US and your local health directors in Canada.
Who are political appointments. But on the other, then these people should apply the same standard on the other side. You have doctors that have zero expertise in epidemiology, and these medical doctors are quite happy to grab the microphone and say, oh, the government should impose more severe lockdowns, it shouldn't lift the lockdowns, and I'm a medical doctor. Here's the thing, though. I think it's very dangerous to put our entire democracy into the hands of one profession, because there's more to life than not dying of COVID. And we're in a sad place right now where people are so afraid of dying that they've forgotten how to live. And all the mental health and physical health harms from all these lockdowns are going to do far more to shorten lives and to damage our immune systems. I mean, if you're sitting at home all the time and you're not out and about and your immune system's just getting weaker and weaker and weaker, it's going to increase your chance of getting COVID and all kinds of other diseases, and it's going to increase your chance of dying of all these diseases because the whole population health is going down. The health of the general population is going downhill when you ban team sports, you ban going to the gym, you ban fun and recreation and going to theaters and hanging out with friends. You ban quality in-person time, that there's no Zoom screen that is a substitute for connecting with somebody in person. You ban all that stuff, you hurt the population health, you're going to end up with more deaths than what you're trying to prevent.
Yeah, so and someone's going to accuse you of being hypothetical. It's intangible right now we're just dealing with. I just want to bring up one super chat because I feel morally obliged. Let me just bring it up here. And then I want to mention two things. Ginoel says, merci pour le travail exceptionnel que tu fais. You are our Canadian Stephen Crowder. You are the real media reporting on the real questions, not the non-cheap Lorette. Thank you very much. And by the way, another super chat, which I brought up briefly, said that the individual made a donation to the JCCF. I'm going to put the link in the pinned comment so everybody knows where to go if they want to support your work. Another guy who had an answer for why there would be no flu this year is another YouTube doctor named Dr. Z-Dog MD. So ZDOGG-MD gives interesting talks, but did explain, because I heard our Dr. Horacio Arruda said there's no flu this year, so if you have symptoms, it's probably COVID. And I thought that was peculiar, but I know when I don't know something. And apparently this Dr. Z-Dog, whose name is Zubian, very smart guy, and I just did a talk with him. He did say that sometimes there are these competing viruses that compete for the path of transmission through the airway. And so there could be some sort of explanation as to why the stronger of the viruses beats out the weaker one in terms of virility. So check him out if you want to get an explanation onto how there could be no flu now or absolutely minimal flu. And then the other issue, but to push back on, what people are going to push back on you about, John, is they'll say, yeah, there's no risk to kids, but kids at one point were thought to be the transmitters. So when it comes to the influenza, I've learned this also from listening to doctors, influenza is transmitted and carried through kids. And I think at the beginning of the lockdowns, that was the understanding, the expectation, the thought process as to why we had to limit, shut down schools, basically.
The evidence that we'll be presenting before the courts in Manitoba, Alberta, and other provinces, the evidence is that children, not only are they not threatened by COVID, but they are not spreaders of COVID. When a child does have COVID in his or her body, it's because they got it from their parents. So, and there's numerous studies, and the governments will, try to have their own studies, and the good thing is that for the first time, this will have to be, the governments are going to have to answer for this. They can't just dismiss it. This is what they're doing now. They're not showing any science. The government could easily post the scientific studies and reports that they're relying on their websites, and typically they don't. They just assert. No, we know best, and we got to close the schools. When they're in court, they're going to have to answer to the scientific evidence and the medical evidence that says that children are not spreaders of COVID, and there's no reason to close schools. And the government will have to put forward evidence. And the sad thing is that they should have been candid with the public from the beginning, because the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms requires that when the government violates rights and freedoms, they have to show the evidence to back up their measures. And the government should have been transparent and honest in providing transparently to the public specifically what science they're relying on. They should have been doing that already for the past 11 months. And it's very disappointing that they are not, and they're doing it now because they get forced to do it by court actions. And that's very disappointing, because we should have transparent, evidence-based public policy should be there all the time. And I want to respond to just briefly this hypothetical, if my long answer about how the lockdowns are damaging population health, and somebody could say, oh, it's conjecture, it's speculation. The lockdowns for the last 11 months are based on speculation and conjecture, because the other question I like to ask people is, name me one example in human history where governments locked down a healthy population for months on end and succeeded in vanquishing a virus.
Right. I could stop at the first half. I don't think there's any historical example of a government in any non-repressive regime locking down the healthy portion of the population. It's like it was. So I do these weekly live streams with Robert Barnes, and we were talking about this from the very beginning, and we're like, uncharted territories, and how deep can this hole go? And at the time, it was like, okay, 2 weeks, and turned into more, and it turned into discussing all of these historical abhorrent decisions out of the U.S., the Buck decision, Korematsu, the Jacobson cases, and we're like, we're full in the middle of that now, where it's nice. We'll have court rulings in a year, 2 or 3 years' time. We don't know which side of history they're going to be on, but by and large, a lot of the feared damage will probably have been done by then. I
fear not, because I think that the media are generating the fear every day in the old days we would have said to sell papers, but now they're all online. Now it's all clickbait. But here's another problem. The media will say, 5,000 new cases, 1,000 new cases, 2,000 new cases, 10,000 cases in this province in this month. The English language, up until 11 months ago, the word case referred to a sick person. So if you say that Canada has 10,000 cases of breast cancer, it means people who actually had breast cancer. Now, a case is somebody that tested positive on a highly unreliable PCR test, which was never designed to diagnose COVID in the first place, which tells you that you may have some remnants of a dead virus, whether it could be COVID, could be something else. When they say there's 1,000 new cases, there's 30 sick people that require hospitalizations. But if the media headline said, 30 people needed to go to hospital, well, okay, that's not a headline. Well, when you say 1,000 cases, so they're twisting and perverting the English language by reassigning a case now means you got something in your system, but you're not sick. But the word used to mean, up until 11 months ago, a case meant a sick person. When the headline says there's 1,000 cases of COVID, they're not talking about 1,000 sick people. They're talking about maybe 30 sick people, 970 people who are perfectly healthy and not sick. And
I discovered that when Legault in Quebec imposed the curfew. And I just looked at how, if our hospitals are overrun, what is the hospitalizations, or what's the hospitalization rate? We had 1,400 people in the hospital, 240 in ICU. And it's not to minimize those numbers, but I was just, when I saw those numbers, I was somewhat shocked that the government is imposing North Korean type measures on a population of 8.5 million, when those are the actual numbers. I want to bring this up because Theo Fastris 3.0 says, I put Barrington Declaration into Google, and what came up first was Barrington Declaration. Okay, so those lawsuits will take their course, and we will hopefully be able to do a follow-up sooner than later. But where I want to go, which something we haven't discussed yet, these quarantine facilities and the people that have been getting whisked away from airports. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, John does, but and everyone watching should, but there have been now, at the very least, 2 confirmed situations where a woman was detained at an airport because she tested positive either for antigens or whatever, but she tested positive upon arrival from an international flight, was told she was being detained at a government designated quarantine facility, but they wouldn't tell her where she was going and they wouldn't tell her husband where she was going. And it's Nikki Mathis and her husband, I don't know, remember his name. They gave interviews, and this is not urban legend lore anymore. And another woman named Rebecca McDonald, her son, who was 20 years old, coming back from Arizona, same thing, taken to an undisclosed location, no lawyer. We were a society of habeas corpus where you had the right to be seen by a judge. In your wildest nightmares of constitutional abuse, would you ever imagine in your lifetime you would be seeing this in Canada?
No, it's unbelievable. It's astounding. We have felt morally superior for decades, if not centuries, to repressive regimes, because repressive regimes, they will lock you up without a charge. So, they're not saying we're charging you with murder, with rape, with sedition, with terrorism. So they lock you up without a charge. You have no access to a lawyer. You get locked up in a secret location, and your detention, your confinement does not get put before a judge for review. So right now we're in a situation in Canada. It's just unbelievable. If you are accused of murder, you have more legal rights than a returning snowbird landing at an airport. Because if you're accused of murder, they have to charge you before they take you away. They have to charge you with an offense. Let's say we're placing you under arrest because we're charging you with a crime. And then where this guy or gal is going to get taken to. I mean, the police station or the prison or whichever. They have a right to call a lawyer. Their friends and family know where they are. They'll know that, okay, well, right now they're at the police station, or right now they've been locked up in a prison. You know where they are. Then their detention gets placed before a judge for review, and they have an opportunity to say, look, let me back out because I'm not a danger to society. Or the judge might say, no, we'll deem you to be a danger to society, and we're going to keep you locked up until trial. But at least it gets reviewed by a judge. We have none of these rights. So this is on the level of Idi Amin's Uganda in the 1970s, or the Argentinian military junta with the mysterious disappearances. When the government can lock you up in a secret location, and why are you denied the right to speak with your friends and family? I mean, does the government now believe that COVID gets spread by telephone?
It's beyond that, because we're not going to have much to disagree with on this. I was flabbergasted. I mean, I heard the reports. People message me these stories, and I don't initially cover them with a vlog or whatever, just because I can't even know that they're true, and I'm not an investigative journalist. So I'll wait for others to report it, and I'll explain it when there's a court filing. People were sending me this message about Nikki Mathis, and I said, it sounds too fishy. I'm not jumping on it because I can't fact check myself from my basement of my lockdown house. But then they're confirmed, and there is no logical basis anywhere in the world, in any realm of imagination, that could justify the secrecy behind it. And on the contrary, and I'm going to remember the time of this video. On the contrary, these are things that need the public scrutiny. It's not, you don't hide these detention centers and these quarantine facilities. They should have picket lines of media out there. They should be supervised, and they should be subject to public scrutiny, if for no other reason, to make sure that there's no chicanery afoot and that people are not being abused. I cannot imagine being a husband, or even being a woman, being taken to a detention center and nobody knows where I am, and I don't know who I'm going with and who's there and what's going to happen to me there, and I'm just supposed to, because we're nice, polite Canadians, I'm supposed to trust the security that takes me there. But it's beyond the pale And the question is, people are asking, like, what can anyone do about it? Do you have any of these cases pending? Or do you
Yes.
have any complaints?
We expect to be filing pretty soon. Looking at the week of February the 15th, we're going to sue the federal government. Nikki Mathis is one of our clients. This is the woman in Alberta who was just hauled off to a secret location. And this is a blatant violation of so many your charter section on mobility rights to freely leave and enter Canada, the life, liberty, and security of the person. One of your basic human rights is that you have the freedom to come and go where you please. You're locked up somewhere. That's a very severe violation of your human rights. What is even more appalling is the federal government justification. I read this, the CBC, which has a pro-lockdown bias. So if they're talking about this, I say it's pretty trustworthy if they're telling a story about somebody harmed by these arbitrary arrests and detentions. This lost my train of thought.
Well, it was about the secrecy of the locations.
Secrecy. Oh yes. So in the CBC stories, the Canada Public Safety Agency, whatever it was, they say we're not revealing where these people are being locked up to protect their safety and privacy.
Yeah,
it's like if your wife got locked up somewhere, her safety is going to be enhanced by you not knowing where she is. What planet are these people living on? And privacy. I mean, I think if your wife got locked up, probably her number one thing would be to want to get out of the place where she's locked up at. Never mind the privacy. She'd probably be very happy if all the media in the world reported about her being locked up there, because that's a method of accountability. And that the federal government would say that, we're locking people up in secret locations. We're keeping it secret for their benefits, for their safety and privacy.
I forget who said it. Who said it? It was something about fascism cloaking itself in benevolence. And I want to bring up Theo Fasters, who's got another good point. I mean, just wait until some bad people figure out you can grab anyone at an airport and whisk them away. This is another thing. It's apparently unmarked cars. They're wearing whatever.
Tinted windows are closed up so that the detained person, the prisoner, effectively can't look outside to see which way the van is going. I'm very happy to hear that Nikki Mathis is with you, is with your team, and you're going to take action, because it deserves action, and it deserves. Some people say Nikki Mathis is going to get rich now. Mostly Americans who don't appreciate Canada's not like that. We don't give those types of payments except under certain circumstances. But this is, and I've seen Nikki Mathis's interview on Fayteen. She's not in this for the money. There's no question about that. This is if there's ever been a question of principle, the idea that you can be hauled off to an undisclosed location for an undisclosed amount of time, you don't even know. And the worst thing is, it's not like, I think paranoid, I think neurotic. It's not like government facilities are the best kept and the cleanest. It's not clear. Like, you get there, it's like, oh, well, we have an outbreak here. Now you got to stay for another 2 weeks. The level of abuse and the level of, and people don't even think about it. I mean, how do you try to wake people up or sensitize people to the seriousness of what is going on, where people say, I don't mind staying at home at 8 o'clock at night. The government's, I can survive off $2,000 a month, and even, or I have a job and I haven't lost my job. So I don't mind. It's inconvenient, but you're making a bigger deal of it than you should. I mean, how do you respond to people who say that? I think lockdowns will be with us for as long as there is substantial public support. And substantial, I don't know if that means 30%, 50%, 70%, but as long as you've got a lot of people that don't know that are ill-informed, they don't know the facts, they assume incorrectly that that this is an unusually deadly virus that we should all be afraid of, when the truth that anybody can look up, you look at the government's own websites, the truth is that this is dangerous for seniors in nursing homes. Outside of the elderly and sick, it is, yes, it's a threat to a small number of people, but it's more dangerous to drive a car. You have a far greater risk of dying from driving a car than what you do from dying of COVID. So as people become more educated and let go of their fear, then we're going to see a shift. Unfortunately, the media, with all the beating the drums of the daily so-called cases, which again, it's not sick people, the media is keeping the population in a state of fear. Fearful people are not thinking straight. And as long as a lot of Canadians remain fearful of the virus, you get this non-thinking, fanatical idea that it doesn't matter what we do. Doesn't matter how destructive the lockdowns are. It doesn't matter if we arrest people and lock them up in secret locations. Doesn't matter, doesn't matter, doesn't matter. We have to save ourselves from this horrible virus. And that's very hard to get through. So it's going to take, at best, it's going to take months. Maybe it's going to take years before the fear finally subsides, because people acquaint themselves with the truth and know that they do not need to be afraid.
Well, I'll push back on one point, because Dr. Dr. Phil got into trouble for saying, drawing the analogy between suicide, ODs, car accidents, and everyone's like, well, those aren't contagious. And so the idea here is that what makes this unique, singularly unique, to justify everything you've just said and everything we've been discussing, is that it's contagious. And it is an absolute act of selfishness to place grandma at risk. And so we should all do everything we can. I mean, this is the
well, what if
trope. You want grandma to die?
Yeah, I personally know grandparents who would gladly take the risk of perhaps catching COVID. Remember too that even for the vulnerable population, there's a 95% survival rate. I mean, generally survival rate for COVID is 99.77%. But even for the elderly, 95% survival rate. So the fact that it's highly contagious is irrelevant, because we're not dealing with the Spanish flu, and we're not dealing with the bubonic plague, and we're not dealing with a virus that is a serious threat in relation to a real pandemic like what you had 100 years ago with the Spanish flu that killed millions and millions and millions of people. That would have been, a good time to try the experiment of lockdowns, and they didn't try lockdowns. So my answer is, yeah, the fact that it's highly contagious is irrelevant, because the lethality of the COVID is in the same range as the annual flu. And that's not my opinion. That's the government's data will tell you that when you look at the government's data.
Let's see here. Rick 910 says, Viva, sorry, you almost sound like you're part of the problem. I don't know if that's sarcastic or ironic, but one thing is important to know is, even when you believe something, it is important to express a legitimate representation of the opposing view.
Well, of course.
And first, I brought up someone else's comment who said suicide is contagious.
Yes, suicide is contagious. That is documented by anthropologists and sociologists and psychologists. You have communities where there's one 14-year-old that kills himself, and in the next 2 months there's 3 or 4 others, because they're all chatting to each other and they've all dragged each other down to the pit of despair. So suicide is also contagious, and depression and anxiety and stress.
And there's the reason why they don't publicly announce why the metro stations are on pause, because of an incident. They don't want to encourage others to do the same thing. Okay, so you got Nikki Mathis is the most publicized egregious example. Have you heard of other cases of this happening, or is it a one or two off? It's a hiccup in the system as they implement these new measures.
Well, the CBC story that I read 2 days ago was very interesting. They interviewed 2 or 3 people who had been detained. I think it was in Calgary. I'm not sure where, but it was horrific. There was a gentleman who had a serious problem with his toe. I forget the specific medical nature of it, but it was painful, and he repeatedly asked for medical help, but they told him, oh, shut up and get over it. Finally, he said, I'm going to call 911 and call for an ambulance. And when they did take him to the hospital, it was confirmed he needed to have his whole toenail removed. It was a serious medical problem, and that people are mistreated in these facilities. Now, in our court action, the government is going to have to demonstrate why it's necessary to lock people up when people are already required to quarantine at home on threat of severe penalties if they break the quarantine. Why is this necessary? Why can people not quarantine at home? And then, of course, the bigger underlying issue, why are we doing any of this for a virus whose lethality has been exaggerated by government, because all the predictions made 11 months ago have proven completely false. This is not a virus that's killing millions and millions of people, and that's inflicting massive permanent health damage on large numbers of young people. The stuff we were told is not true, and the government's own data and statistics tell us that it's not true.
The what was I just about to say? Oh, I forget now. I lost my thought. Darn it. Oh, no, it was the penalties under the Quarantine Act. Most people, it's the legitimate point is the penalties are already 6 months in jail and a fine of $750,000 if you breach an order under the Quarantine Act, one of the ones that fits within those categories. So the idea is that you can't even let people run that risk at home. And it is the other amazing thing which people don't appreciate. It's led to the situations of police escalation where, you know, the fines are supposed to be the fines for non-compliance, not forced compliance on the spot. And so this is what leads to these escalations where people get pepper sprayed because the police come in and say, it's not just a question of me issuing you a fine now, I want immediate compliance, which is not necessarily what the law provides for. It provides for penalties in the event of non-compliance. And then you let the courts take care of it, as opposed to on the spur of the moment escalation. So you've got, okay.
So we are now a police state in Canada, and I think to say otherwise is just a denial of reality. But you know, police states, repressive regimes have always had their supporters, because governments never violate your rights and freedoms without giving you an ostensibly good reason, a reason that seems to be good for that particular country, population at that particular time. So you see the pretexts are all over the map. Governments will take away your rights and freedoms in order to fight terrorism, in order to build a workers' paradise, in order to create more Lebensraum, in order to fight communism. There's always a pretext. And you know, these pretexts ultimately, they don't hold water, because the best way to protect, you know, against various evils is to have a strong, robust, prosperous, free, democratic society. That is the best protection that we could have against any number of problems. So now, instead of saying, well, we're trying to build the workers' paradise, or we're trying to fight terrorism, or or we've got an evil neighbor next door that's aggressive and dangerous, therefore we need to take rights and freedoms away because of foreign enemies, because of communism, because of this, because of that. Well, now the pretext is COVID. But you know, it's a lie, because again, the government's data and statistics tell us that this is not an unusually deadly killer that warrants the kind of measures that we're seeing. But there's always a pretext for a police state.
Let me ask you another obvious question. Do you get in, I don't think you care much about social media, but do you get in trouble? Do you get, you know, hate mail, emails, whatever, any harassment because of the position you take on the government response?
We get love mail and hate mail. I don't know off the top of my head what the ratio is, but we've had death threats. I mean, we had a while back there, a nasty voicemail that you know, somebody said if he ever had the chance to get his hands on me, he would rip my head off and gouge my eyes out first. And you know, we get some hate mail and we get a lot of shame on you, but we also get a lot of, you know, heart-wrenching emails from people that they're at the end of their rope. They've had suicide attempts. Their entire business has been destroyed. Their life savings are wiped out. You know, seniors that are confined in the last 12 months of their life, which is kind of the average lifespan in a nursing home, they're isolated, like what's it called in prison?
Solitary confinement.
Yeah, it's like solitary confinement. They're cut off from their own loved ones, and they're confined to a room without any love or attention or affection. That's how they spend their last few months. I mean, this is just incredibly cruel. So we've gone to bat. We've taken the government to court over the mistreatment and abuse of seniors in nursing homes because of lockdown measures. So we're getting a lot of support mail as well, and people are saying, you know, you're the only voice in Canada against lockdowns, which is not true. There's all kinds of, it's wonderful. We have lots of grassroots organizations and groups. Yeah, so we get love mail and hate mail both, and that's par for the course.
And on that vein, I mean, it's an anecdote that I've shared a couple of times with my wife's grandmother, 95, just passed away, not from COVID, but after 9 months of basic isolation. I mean, we visited her after the lockdown, and and there was no hugging, no nothing, and she was called her chubby cheek granny because she had these cheeks. All she wanted to do was hug and touch and that, and you take that away. She passed away not from COVID, and the last 9 months of her life were what it was, and I get tons of emails.
And then they want to talk about compassion. If you oppose the lockdowns, you're not compassionate. Well, the name calling doesn't help. I'm not going to say that the pro-lockdown side is lacking compassion. I mean, everybody's compassionate, right? But we have to just take a hard look. What are these policies actually doing? And they're inflicting harm and suffering on seniors in nursing homes to an incredible degree. And it's just abuse, and we need to end it. So, for compassion's sake, we need to get rid of these lockdown measures.
And out of Quebec, one of the counterintuitive results was when they locked everybody down and they restricted the people who could work, you ended up recycling employees who were infected employees among all these long-term healthcare facilities, which exacerbated the spread. So the policy itself, other than being whatever constitutionally, was totally counterproductive from the intended ostensible objectives. There was another one I had. I get these emails about people. I mean, people who say they've depressed, all of it, and and they ask me, what can I do? There's not much I can do. Three things. Go for it.
Three things people can do. First one is, well, maybe more than three. Educate yourself. Justice Center website, obviously, I'm going to recommend that. I'm biased, but there's all kinds of. There's one. There's a lot of good websites, and look at lockdown harms, and read up more. Talk to your elected representative, your federal member of parliament, your provincial MPP, MNA, MLA, what have you. It's easy to talk to people that already agree with you, but give the message to the politicians that the lockdowns are harmful. If anybody wants to distribute brochures about lockdown harms, contact the Justice Center. I want to see 1 million brochures put into 1 million Canadian mailboxes in the next few months. Talk to your friends, educate people, keep on speaking the truth, and exercise your rights and freedoms. Go outside, and if you get a $1,200 ticket, you can contact the Justice Center, and I can't absolutely guarantee you that we will be able to represent you, but we're taking on as many cases as possible.
And Ezra Levant also has Fight the Fines. I mean, Ezra Levant and Rebel Media, yes. Rebel News are doing. Some people don't like it, but they're doing work that nobody else is doing, and you're doing work that nobody else is doing. JCCF, I'm going to put the link in the pinned comment so everybody can know where to go to get info to support you if they want to. I'm going to see if anybody has any questions that we didn't get to. I think, John, we covered a lot. I don't want to keep you longer than, I said, an hour and a half. I know what you must be doing in a day. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you wanted to get out there?
No, I think your question, we've covered a lot of ground, and your questions are great, and I'm really enjoying the conversation. And if you want to have another chat in a month or 2 or 3 or whatever, let's have another chat. But
we'll do the update and see where things are. I mean, and I don't want anyone getting any unreasonable expectations. They're not going to expect any court rulings in the next few months. I mean, this is going to be the long-term game.
Yes.
Okay, let's see. I'm just going to quickly survey the chat and see if there's anything other than comments. We have a good crowd here, so I know. Sorry, that's not the comment I wanted to pick up. Jesus. Just so everybody knows, I didn't intend to pick up the comment. I'm going to go back. Oh, it says JCCF has merch. We've got Proteus with thank you. And we got okay. Look, I mean, it's you guys know where to go. John, you're doing serious work, and you guys are now your team of 10 lawyers full time, basically on these constitutional lockdown issues. I imagine.
Yes, I mean we still have lots of other, because these cases, all the court cases go on for years and years. And before the lockdowns, we're doing all kinds of work on protect the Yaniv case. You've probably heard about the
Sure.
transgender person wanted male genitals waxed for Brazilian bikini wax, and so we defended these poor immigrant women who were terrorized by these human rights complaints from this biological male wanting to go into to get private parts waxed, and it was, we succeeded. We defended these women. They were quite traumatized by having these complaints filed against them. But so we have other court cases on the go as well. But certainly in 2021, I expect that the lockdowns will be perhaps the majority of our legal work will be involving lockdowns. But we're doing work across the board on other rights and freedoms as well that don't involve lockdowns.
Okay, excellent. So we will do it. We'll do a follow-up. We'll do a catch-up, see where things are in a month's time. John, thank you very much. Stick around. We'll say our proper goodbyes afterwards. But everybody, thanks for tuning in. Share the video around. It's great. Some of you out there may disagree with John and the litigation that he's filing, but what is it? Liberty lost is never regained. It's a poem. Who said that? Liberty lost is never regained. And the bottom line is, you either value certain fundamental freedoms, which you may be prepared to relinquish if there's an urgent and justifiable enough cause, or you don't. And the harsh reality of liberties is, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government measure. So got to keep it in check. Let's see here. We got kudos to Viva and John Carpay. Great live stream. And Mike Riendo says, from a dry friend in the US, I wonder where those celebrities went who all wanted to settle up north. Yep. Well, one thing's for certain. I don't know who's clamoring to come to Canada now. And another thing is for certain. The curfew and lockdown, the curfew, at least in Quebec, came just in time for all of those politicians who were vacationing in the sunny islands to get back in time for the orders. John, thank you very much again. Everybody, stay tuned. We'll see where this goes, and enjoy the rest of the week.
Right. Until